So I don't see myself as that I'm dying with cancer. I see that I'm living with it. And when I say that it's been the harshest teacher, it's also been the best teacher too.
David Smith, British Paralympic gold medalist rower.
I was training 7 days a week. I had 1 day off every 3 weeks, but then I started to have some health issues again. Things started to flare up, and I was working very closely with the physio team at the time, and they said things are not going quite right here. And at that point, my whole life was about to change. That surgery ended up being not so straightforward and almost killed me. Every minute of every day had a specific goal, a specific intention, and every goal and intention was to get back in a boat. Within 6 months of that surgery, I was back in a boat. Within 11 months, I was world champion, and within 12 months, I'd won a gold medal in London. The strategy and the philosophy I used at that point was that I wanted to win. In 2016, I was paralysed from the neck down. And then for the 8 years that preceded that, I clung on to the identity of David as an athlete. The one thing that defined me was taken away from me.
Hey man, how are you?
Very well, thank you, Peter. It's great to link up with you today. I'm really excited for the conversation we're going to explore and have over the next hour, 90 minutes.
Yeah, me too. We connected a little bit ago on LinkedIn. I remember listening to some of the podcasts that you've been on, such as, I think it was a high performance podcast I was listening to. And yeah, I was blown away by your story. I found it extremely inspirational and also extremely moving. And I felt that it was a good opportunity to get you on and share your amazing journey that you've been through and the ebbs and flows of all of it. So thank you very much for your time.
No, thank you. I always live by a philosophy that we have 18,400 seconds a day. And we can show up or turn up to those seconds. And I always say to people, the greatest gift they get at Christmas is time. Time is so precious, yet taken for granted and not fully understood. We've very much become human doings rather than human beings. If we can come from a place of human being, we have a better relationship with time and especially other people's time. I'm so grateful for your time today. For anyone listening, I thank you deeply for your time and tuning in and listening to our discussion, because time is truly something that we don't get it back. We can make money, lose money, but we can never get the time back that we spend. So I'm always very intentional in how I spend time. Yeah, I have a very bizarre relationship with time, which I'm sure we're going to unwrap over the next hour.
I think time's an important thing, because if anybody looks at your journey just on a surface level, they'll look towards like the Olympic medal and winning gold in London 2012. But there comes a time before that. So if we look at the early years, what motivated you, I guess, to pursue high level, elite level sport?
I've been having some discussions recently with fellow coaches in sport and people who have spent a lifetime in sport. And we sort of discussed around a model of access to sport. And this really spiked my curiosity from a psychological standpoint, is that there was 4 routes that people take into sport. One is through trauma. They've had trauma and they find sport through a traumatic experience. Second one is they want to be famous. There's a route into sport through, I could become famous through doing this. It could be a catalyst to fame. The third one is that I have a great family, everything's stable at home. My parents take me to sport. I absolutely love it and I'm good at it. I'm going to pursue a career in it. And then the fourth way is I'm kind of not quite sure what I'm doing in life. I get picked up by a talent ID day run by a sporting sort of program. I find out I'm really good at something. I might not particularly love it, but I'm very good at it and it can take me to the Olympics. And that's the sort of the 4 models. And it's not to say one person's just purely in one category. There can be a mix of 4. I think for me, initially, I grew up in a little village in Scotland. We played a sport, shinty. My dad loved sport, so I skied. I loved going to karate. And I generally just had a love and a passion for doing sport. It was not something I wanted to do professionally. I knew I wanted a career in sport, but it wasn't per se as an athlete or trying to go on and be on national teams. I just loved being part of a team. All my sports as a junior were a lot of team sports as well. So I liked the we in team sport rather than the I in individual sport. And I ultimately just fell in love. I grew up in a council estate in the north of Scotland and I just loved running around with my mates. I struggled with attention. So I just loved sport as a catalyst to spend my energy. And there was also a little bit of trauma in there as well. I come from a sort of, I guess what you would call a bit of a broken home. So there was also to deal with the trauma that was happening there. I would find myself going towards the gym and using sport as a mechanism to deal with those built up emotions, not understanding as a 10-year-old kid how to deal with my thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I found that I could basically burn energy punching a punch bag or lifting weights for 2-3 hours a day. And this burnt and dealt with all my emotions. So my route into sport wasn't through, I've seen the Olympics, I want to go to the Olympics. It was very much about dealing with trapped emotions, and also simply because my parents took me to sport and I grew up in a really sporty environment. It was just, it's what we did. And ultimately that grew into more of a love, which became an obsession, which became a lifestyle. And up until probably 6 weeks ago, it consumed me. And it was the root of all of my suffering.
The root of your suffering?
This is going a little bit into Buddhist philosophy around the Four Noble Truths. And the first truth of that we will suffer in life. And the second truth, we suffer because of our desires and our wants for more. In 2016, I was paralyzed from the neck down due to a mistake in a surgery to move a tumour from my spinal cord. So I lost everything on the left side. And then for the 8 years that preceded that, I clung on to the identity of David as an athlete. So I purely identified as, if someone said to me, what do you do? I'm an athlete. That was it. I had no other sort of identity. I was just a fixed identity as David Smith, the athlete. And actually my website is David Smith Athlete. So I really defined as this sports person. 2016, the one thing that defined me was taken away from me. And then for 8 years, I clung on to this identity. I couldn't let it go. I was trying to pursue a dream in paracycling, which clearly was never going to lead. I was just too injured. I was too disabled. And then I was like, maybe I can do shooting, or maybe I can do this other sport, or maybe I can. It was always trying to hold on because I desired that identity. I wanted more of that identity. And I wasn't ready to sort of let go. And it caused, and I didn't realize this happened probably only like 6 weeks ago, that the root of all of my suffering wasn't the fact I'd been paralyzed. It was the fact that I just couldn't accept the paralysis, surrender to it. And at the other end of acceptance and surrender is freedom. So if the freedom from letting go of that fixed identity to understand that my identity is like a river, it's flowing, it's changing, it's taking shape through form, through thoughts, feelings, experiences, consciousness, and actually realizing that in many ways I just am. I'm nothing, I just am. And wherever I am at that moment, I can adapt and be malleable into that identity. And ultimately that led to my freedom from the torture and the suffering of the grieving of the loss of my physical body that I had only known as my identity for 20, 25, 30 years.
So from a grief and loss perspective, how would you compare and contrast yourself to that David of the past? Because if you look at the journey that you've been through, not everybody knows the various sports that you've represented. If we talk a little bit about that, and also the process of grief before we dive into the day that the ego died.
Yeah, so pre-cancer, pre-paralysis, David, I represented my village in Shinty, which is a Scottish sport. I was national champion. That led on to karate. I fought in 3 world championships in Japan, South Africa, and Russia in Shotokan karate. I spent a month traveling Japan, fighting in all different types of dojos. I got my black belt in karate. I spent a short time as a 200, 400 meter sprinter. I was East of Scotland 400 meter champion. I had aspirations of trying to make it to the Commonwealth Games, World Championships in athletics. Unfortunately, I was born, or that tumour started to grow at the age of 18 in my spinal cord. So it was crushing all the nerves to my whole body. So the harder I pushed in athletics, the more issues I had with my body, and I would have convulsions. I would fall over. I'd lose the ability to walk. Doctors would always tell me I'm doing too much sport. And so I naturally sort of kind of weaved my way through life. And then after athletics, I found myself pushing on the side of the Great Britain bobsleigh team. I did a few World Cup races on the British bobsleigh team. That led into a 2-year career with the British Alpine ski team as an assistant coach and fitness coach. So I traveled the world with the Olympic skiers, skiing in Chile, on the World Cup circuit, all over Austria, Switzerland, Italy. An incredible time. And then during that time, I was also introduced to a talent ID day at Loughborough University, where I jumped on a rowing machine for the first time. And I pulled a fairly impressive score, which led me to training with the British rowing team for 5-6 years, which then led into 7 years on the British cycling team. So there was a whole host of sports that I'd done. I never say that I was any good at any of them, but what I love is that I got lots of experiences. And I also, when I've lay in hospital beds during this whole cancer diagnosis and treatment, at that point, we don't have medals, we don't have TVs and cars, we only have memories. And memories are made from experiences, and especially savouring those experiences. And the great thing with sport, it's a direct access into, you really have to live and be where your feet are. So, people talk about flow states or being in the zone. Sport's a great gateway to getting into those zones and really being present. And when you're present, you can really savor the moment. And what I love about the fact that I was very blessed to have done so many different sports. I know what it's like to fight in a dojo in Japan. I also know what it's like to go down the Cresta Run in San Moritz, or to be at the top of Kitzbühel with 100,000 spectators at the World Cup downhill. I know what it's like to stand on the start line of a 400-meter race when you've got an Olympic sprinter on your inside and someone else on your outside. I've been part of team sports with Shinty. Also on the cycling, it was very individual. I know what it's like to roll down the ramp in Italy and do a UCI World Cup time trial. So I know it's nice to reflect on all of those experiences. And I often live by the philosophy that sport gave me the physiology and mindset to deal with cancer and paralysis, but ultimately cancer and paralysis have been my biggest teacher in life. And they've really shown me how to live and what's really important. And I think Sir Chris Hoy's recent book of when he wrote All That Matters delves really deeply into that. When you're given a terminal diagnosis, is what that really means and how you put things into perspective. And I really do try to live in the moment. I try not to live into the future. I think it's nice to reflect back on the sports. They've certainly gone to shape me as a person in many ways. But ultimately, I think where I am in life now, I don't often talk about the sports. I don't often focus on them. I really try to be in the moment and live in the moment. Humility is a really important value of mine. And I often feel sometimes if I'm talking about the sports, it's very much, I did this and I did that. And conversations that really move me now sometimes is I love to listen to people, but I also love to talk about ideas and what can we do as a collective human race to make today better, to make tomorrow better. And yes, a lot of those principles come from a life of sport. And I think I'm very blessed to have pulled on a Great Britain top and competed for my country. But I certainly realize now that doesn't define who I am as a human being.
I think ultimately who we become comes largely through that post-traumatic growth. For those that are listening and watching, looking into when you first were faced with that diagnosis, can we hark back to that point and look at the training that you're going through and how it almost seemed like a frustration in some podcasts that I've listened to you talk before?
Yeah, I think it's super interesting for me to reflect because I liken it to a boxer sometimes as well. And the strategy you have in round 1 to 3 is completely different in round 12. And I feel like I'm in round 14 now. So my philosophy to dealing with it and managing it has completely changed. Initially, when I was diagnosed, I was on the British rowing team. I was training 7 days a week. I had 1 day off every 3 weeks. We were training. Our first session would start at 7 o'clock in the morning. We would go out in the water, row 18 kilometers, come in, have breakfast. Then we would do 18 kilometers on a rowing machine, have a break, and then go either on the bike for an hour or go to the gym for an hour, go home, have dinner, go to bed, repeat. And that was it. And that was life. And I loved it. But then I started to have some health issues again. Things started to flare up. And ultimately, I was working very closely with the physio team at the time. And they said, look, things are not going quite right here. We need to do a little bit of an investigation. That investigation started initially with sending me up to London to do tests on my bladder, on my bowel. I was repeatedly going to the toilet maybe 10, 15 times a night. So before sleep trackers and all of these data things were fashionable, we were using something very similar to Whoop and Oura Ring at British Rowing 14 years ago. So they were collecting my sleep data and they could see lots of fragmentations and lots of just not good sleep. So that started to ring alarm bells. And those tests were pretty grim, but they came back all clear. And then one of the physios said, you know what, I think we should scan your spine. We'll probably find some bulging discs. I jumped in the car, went to Weybridge, which is in Surrey, jumped in, had a scan. And at that point, my whole life was about to change. Within a day, I would find myself sat in a neurological ward in Windsor, where a neurologist sort of held up a scan and he said, look, you've got this mass in your spinal cord. This is way beyond my capacity. I need to refer you to a neurosurgeon. And within a week, I was sat in Oxford in front of a neurosurgeon who was telling me that he was going to cut the front of my neck open, cut through the vertebrae, cut into the dura, go into the spinal cord, remove the tumour, put me back together, put in some screws and cages, and I'd be back in a boat in 3 months. Sounded very straightforward. Unfortunately, that surgery led to a spinal stroke, which temporarily paralysed me from the neck down and almost killed me. And it ended up being not so straightforward. It ended up being a month lying in a hospital bed looking at the roof. I went in as a 105 kilo rower and I came out of hospital, I think around 65 to 68 kilograms. And within 6 months of that surgery, I was back in a boat. Within 11 months, I was world champion. And within 12 months, I'd won a gold medal in London. The strategy and the philosophy I used at that point was that I wanted to win. And everything I did, it was about winning in London. So the underpinning of that was discipline. Every morning at 7 a.m., I would visualize and use imagery in my hospital bed of the boat going onto the water. So I'd close my eyes, I could smell the fresh air, and I could feel the ground under my feet, the boat got into the water. And I would do a visualization for the full hour and a half at the same time as I knew that boat was going on the water. So that's how disciplined I was. Every minute of every day had a specific goal, a specific intention, and every goal and intention was to get back in a boat. But that goal was so overwhelming, I had to strip it all the way back. The very first thing I could do was just touch my finger on my nose. So that was the first, because every time I tried to do it, I couldn't find my nose. So that's just to show you how badly my nervous system was knocked out. Then it was to sit up. Then it was to stand. Then it's, can I take a step? Then another step. Then it was to make it round the nurse's counter in the hospital. So it was all of these little small goals, which you get tuned into your dopamine pathways. You get those small wins. And always in my back of my mind was this big goal, this overwhelming, like I need to get there. And ultimately I got there, crossed that finish line. My initial thought was like, that's me. I've had my cancer, my tumor. I can close the book on that. I'm going to go home. I'm going to go and do some skiing and mountain climbing. And home was very regimental. And I grew up doing a lot of free sports. So I loved the not running in the lines. I loved the mountains where you could ski and take your own lines rather than being told where to go. So I went back to that sort of roots of just doing sport for the pure freedom and pleasure of it. And I was blessed. I grew up skiing, so we'd done a lot of backpacking and skiing into the back corries in Scotland. And then as the snow started to melt, I found a bike in my garage. I jumped on the bike and I was like, I love this. And within 3-4 months of doing that, I was on the British cycling team. And the whole ethos of those early stages of the cancer, and it was very much fight with it. And I used sport as my goal. So in 2014, I was re-diagnosed again. They cut me down through the back of the neck. I had to go through the same process again. But my goal there was, okay, in 6 months' time, I'm going to ride up Mont Ventoux 3 times in one day. And in 7 months, I'm going to start in the World Cup in Italy in the time trial. So everything I did from the minute I woke up in ICU was to get me to Mont Ventoux and was to get me to the UCI time trial. I did both of them. 3 months after the UCI time trial, I was re-diagnosed again. And so we're now in September 2015 and we postponed surgery because there was a chance I could have made the Rio Games on the bike. But in March 2016, the diagnosis that had been presented in September 2015, that tumor had grown even more and we had to go for an emergency surgery. And it was that surgery that would leave me in hospital for almost a year. And even then, when I woke up in ICU, my first 2 goals, the first goal was I'm going to cycle for Great Britain again, and I'm going to cycle 740 kilometers across the Alps. So still very performance goals, very performance driven by discipline, persistence, resilience, single-mindedness. It was very much about me. I am going to do these things. Everyone else around me, this is the selfish mindset of the athlete I was. I was like, I'm going to do these things. And it worked. By 2017, I was back on a bike racing for Great Britain. And in 2018, I did the cycle ride, paralysed from the neck down, only with my right arm and right leg. I rode across all of the hardest passes that you see in the Tour de France in 1 week from Lake Geneva to Monaco. So those goals all work, but they don't work now.
Listening from a mindset perspective, that's something that I want to delve into, because during that period, the single-mindedness of the focus of the goal supported you through that, which is clear. But also, how are your family coping? Because I know if my loved one was facing a similar situation, the last thing I'd want them to do is focus on competition. I'd want to focus on the care. During
that whole time, I was single, so I didn't have a partner. So it was very easy for me just to be like, it's just me. Mum and dad, they're in the north of Scotland. I'm down south. Probably not the strongest relationship. I have some half sisters and stuff, but it very much was like, it's just me. And this is my path and this is my journey. So I really just had that single mind focus, and it worked. But there was some real dark times. There were some really low moments. Surgery 1, surgery 2, 3, probably not, because I came out of them and I wasn't fully paralyzed. I just had this sort of temporary where I'd gone from maybe 100 kilos to 65 kilos. I didn't have any strength, so I had to build up. But the great thing with that is you've seen immediate results. Every time you did something, every time you did a gym session, you're like, wow, I can feel I'm a little bit stronger. You could see tangible scores changing on rowing machines, on bikes. When I was paralyzed, initially when I woke up in ICU in 2016, they said, look, you're going to move again, don't worry. Then I was on a high dependency ward for a couple of weeks. Then I was moved into a neurological ward for 8 weeks. And the doctors would come around every day and they would just say, I wish all our patients were like you. What a mindset. I was doing my physio in my bed. I was visualizing. I had a whole setup that I created around getting me from this bed back onto the national team. And I hadn't accepted at that point that I had a spinal injury. And then after 9 weeks, they're like, we're moving you to Stoke Mandeville. So they come and put me into a wheelchair. They wheel me through the ward. I go downstairs. It's the first time I breathed fresh air in almost 9-10 weeks. And then they put me into the special bus, that I call it, where they clip me in my wheelchair and they drive me. And I was watching the world go past. And I almost felt like I was going to prison because I couldn't leave. I was here. Like, I don't want to be here. And this has never been like this before. I've always come in, had surgery, left. By now I'd be back skiing, running, lifting weights. And all of a sudden, you're taking me to Stoke Mandeville? What is this place? So I arrive at Stoke Mandeville, they push me through, and the first person I see is a young guy who's a complete quadriplegic. And I was like, whoa, wow. And he could only really move his eyebrows and eyes. This is intense. So then they wheel me into my ward, and there was a guy in the bed next to me who was a rugby player, and he just went, get out of here. Get out of here. He hated it. So that was my first introduction. Then after that, a doctor came round and he said, we're going to an initial assessment on you. And he wasn't very nice. His bedside manner was very poor, a young doctor. So they lay me in the bed, they took cotton wool and they took a needle and they ran the cotton wool over my body and they pinched me with a needle. And from this, they then come up with who I am. So this then plays into identity. So they told me, you are tetraplegic C2 incomplete Asia D. So it was like a prison number. And I was like, huh? What does that even mean? And they're like, that's who you are. So then when you meet people in Stoke Mandeville, it's almost like the first question was like, what are you? Are you an incomplete or are you a complete? And then if you got past that, it was like, are you a Asia D and Asia B and Asia A? And it was almost like to form your in group and your out groups. And it was a really weird psychology. And I was still clinging on to the identity. Well, I'm an athlete. So I remember the doctor left and he left me lying on this bed and I couldn't really move. After a couple of days, I had like a goal planning meeting. So I wheeled in my wheelchair to the goal plan meeting and the doctors and nurses in there asked me, what's your goals? And I said, I want to ride for Great Britain and I want to cycle across the Alps. And they looked around the room And the nurse said, well, I think we should start with brushing your teeth. And I was just like, yeah, we're not going to get on. And I still had that same mindset from surgery 1, surgery 2. Like, I'm on a different level. And it served me well, but it also, I needed that to get out of there. So I was at the gym 10 minutes early every day. I would push my wheelchair with me in it down to the Gutman Center, which was a sports center attached to the hospital. I would be down there at 6 o'clock at night in the gym doing weights, trying to get more. I was doing more and more. I was like, I'm going to walk out of here. And within all of that, there were some really dark moments because there's people who were completes. They're never walking, no matter how much. And I remember one guy asking me to put a pillow over his head and suffocate him because he just didn't want to live. So you're meeting all these people who are at the worst time in their life. They've all been paralyzed. They've woke up like you woke up today, and they've maybe slipped on the floor, and that's them paralyzed. They've dived into a swimming pool and hit their head, paralyzed. One guy had rolled out his bed to try and hit his alarm clock, paralyzed from the neck down. So you lose all your independence. There are people pooing themselves left, right, and center. There were people getting suppositories put in, catheters, and wetting the bed, and we were having to get bed baths. So it's become this big baby, but you're identified by what you are. And within all of that, oh my God, there was like times where I didn't want to live anymore. There was just, it was a massive roller coaster of emotions. I don't think there is a coping strategy for it. It's so extreme that you just do what you need to do to get through it. And most people find a way. Most people do very well. They find a way, they go through the grief and the trauma, and they find some form of acceptance and meaning and purpose after it, and they go on to have a great life. But in that initial stages, it is really hard.
Yeah, because I guess it challenges your control, and all of a sudden you go from a situation whereby you are in full control of your outcomes into a situation where you have to lean into the reliance of others and vulnerability and therapy and also being put into a situation. I'd imagine the limitation and removal of any form of control must have been insane. Keen to contrast the David of today versus David of then, and I guess like how today's David would have faced a similar situation.
Good question. I'm not even sure if today's David could, but I say that, and if I was put into it, then I would find a way, because I think I would have to go back to the old David to find that drive, that will to survive, the will to live. And when you go through a spinal injury once, it's tough. I've been through it 7 times because I've had 7 spinal surgeries. So I've built myself up and then had to go back to the start again. And it's that repetition. It just eventually, it's like a candle burning. You eventually can't light the candle anymore. I feel a little bit like that. And within that journey, I've got to a point where I accept my impermanence. I'm fully aware that I will die, and I'm okay with that. And my last surgery was in November 2023. And I probably, after 14 years of hospitals, I think I probably had my biggest existential experience within all of that, with the gentleman in the bed next to me dying. And I lived his final days with him through a shower curtain. And I remember as he was spending his last days, I was reading a book and it said, what if we didn't measure life in time, but we measured it in experiences? We could then argue that the human being who wakes up with the same mindset and does the same thing every day only lives a day. But the person who wakes up with an open mind, goes out every day with good intentions, it has a multitude of experiences, lives 1,000 lives. And I thought to myself, that's me. Now, I would rather live to 50 and live a life rich in experiences than live to 100 and never really live a day just to exist. So I don't see myself as that I'm dying with cancer. I see that I'm living with it. And when I said that it's been the harshest teacher, it's also been the best teacher for me to fully understand the impermanence of life. If I was to be put back into that situation, which I was last year, I didn't go to a spinal hospital, but I had to face spinal surgery again last year. And I remember walking through Queen's Square I remember I'd been in Jamaica playing golf, tennis, basketball, swimming, gym. I was super fit. I was still cycling. I could go and cycle 160K. And then at 7 o'clock in the morning, I stood with both feet on the pavement in Queen Square. And then I just stepped over the line into reception. And I'd gone from David Smith, human, sportsman, back to patient. I'm now in patient mode. And it was like, I'm making my way to Lady Anne ward. Okay, I need to walk through the corridor, go up onto Lady Anne ward. The doors are locked because it's a neurological high dependency ward. So the doors get opened. They walk in. I walk in with this other gentleman who was also there for surgery. And the surgeons were deciding, do we operate on him first, who's a slightly easier case, or do we operate on me first, who's a bit more complex? So it was like, do we warm up on him and then do the main event, or do we do the main event first, then up? So I knew that was him. So I wished him well. I walked around to Bay 4, got into bed 12, and I just went into this psychology again of being like, okay, I know what's coming. I know how to prepare for it, and I will just do what I know. And I think the great thing I feel like I have wisdom on this journey now, not just knowledge. So I think back in 2016, I had knowledge where I pushed really hard, and then would fall over. I didn't deal with it psychologically well. I thought I was dealing with it really well at the time, but on retrospect, I don't think I did deal with it very well at the time. I think I had low emotional intelligence. I didn't really deal with the physio very well. And I was butting heads a lot because I was just quite stubborn. This is what I'm going to do. And I think there was a lot of cognitive distortion around the perception of what I was perceiving and what the medical staff were perceiving. Where the David now, I'm a bit more tactile around having those discussions with physios, and because the physio just turns up to the bed, they don't know who you are, they just have a tick list. So I have a little bit better way of managing those relationships now. But I went back to doing exactly what the old David did to the values. And I think this is a key thing with values when we link them to identity. We can identify, even though I don't identify as David the sportsman anymore, the values that underpin that, the discipline, the persistence, the focus, attention to detail, they're all still there. I just need to transfer them. So I transfer them. They come to the forefront again, right? This is what I need to do to get better. And within 7 days of that surgery, I walked out. I was back on a bike within 8 days, and I went skiing 4 weeks after surgery. I was back on the slope skiing.
That's insane. I guess looking at a situation like that, you talk about cancer being one of your biggest teachers. And in that regard, it's also one of people's greatest fears. Relating that to people that go through their own troubles and traumas at this moment in time, and the lessons that you've learned in that kind of post-traumatic growth phase, what would you say to people in similar situations?
It's a difficult thing. I don't think there's any preparation. There's no course. There's nothing that can prepare you for a diagnosis like that. I think having an understanding and acceptance of mortality, knowing that they call it the meditation of memento mori, that we will die. And that, of course, it's scary. It's going to be scary. I'm not going to tell people that, oh, don't be scared. I certainly wouldn't use the words just be positive. I think that's the worst thing you can say to any human being, especially a human that's facing a terminal diagnosis or a rough time. If you say to someone, just be positive, then it's not allowing them to feel the full emotion. You're going to feel all the emotions. I often say to people when I meet them in oncology that there is no right and wrong. There's your way. And to be compassionate with yourself, to be kind to yourself, and to allow yourself what you need to do. If you need to sit and scream and cry, that's what you do. If you feel like you need to talk to people about it, that's what you do. If you feel like you need to go very deep into yourself and not speak about it, that's what you do. I don't think there is a right and wrong way of how you manage it and how you deal with it. I'd always advise people to have a support network. I think that's super, super crucial. I think counseling is a great thing. I think sitting down with somebody who has experience in working with people who are facing this is super beneficial. And that's something that I've massively benefited from. And I think what is great when you go to oncology and you go into a treatment such as radiotherapy, there's such a massive support network around. I get treated at UCLH in London, and Macmillan have a living room where you can go into at any time. And there's counselors, there's volunteers, there's people who have firsthand experience with cancer. There's nothing worse if you don't feel people understand you. I stopped talking to a lot of my friends about it because they just offered solutions. And I didn't want solutions. I knew the solutions. What I wanted was someone just to listen so I could just offload. And I actually found that was better sometimes with a stranger, or more so with people who were going through it. And you could just offload. I didn't need someone to tell me, you got to set a goal. You got to go and do this. You just got to stay positive. It's all going to be okay. But those words can be so damaging to someone who's facing a terminal diagnosis. But what I also learned, and it was also backed up, I recently read Dr. Ranal Chandy's book, who's a brain surgeon, specializes in stage 4 cancer. And, he said that most of his patients do well. And when he said that in a podcast, and then I read it in his book, I thought, you know what, you are right. Most of the people I've met, whether they're living for 3 months, 3 years, they find a way. There's people who don't. There's people who really struggle, and the end is extremely painful. But at the moment, I have 3 or 4 friends who have had surgery recently for tumours. I've got a very good friend dealing with cancer, and they're all doing really well. They're scared. And I think it's to say, well, you're going to be scared. That's okay to experience the fear. But ultimately, they get themselves together. They go to their scans. The same with me. I'm terrified. I woke up last night at 2 a.m. just thinking, oh my God, what if my next scan is a positive one? Or what if it's a negative scan? What if it's not a good scan? And I thought to myself, okay, that's an okay thought to have, but it is just a thought. It's just a thought which creates a feeling, which creates an emotion, which creates an action. I was like, let's just stop it at the thought, acknowledge the thought, distance myself from the thought and say, that is just a reasonable thought to have, but it's not a fact. It is just a belief. So I try not to listen to those beliefs and let the mind run away with itself. And that's where I think if you are diagnosed and you're facing something like that, rather than trying to do it all on your own, find someone who can work with you on a sort of counseling side, and they can start to get you to understand what the psychology of that diagnosis is going to do to you. Because if you've got 6 months left to live, or a year, or whatever it is you're facing, even though that is horrendous news and it's terrible, I try to say to myself, would I want to spend that year miserable, blaming the world? Or would I want to do it with humility, dignity? Humor is a great trait of mine. Would I want to be funny, make people laugh? That's who I am as a person. So where I say sport didn't define me, I wouldn't want cancer to define me. So if that's who I am as a person, I still want to be that person right up to the very last breath I take. And that takes me back to the guy, Roberto, that I met last year in hospital when he died. His last breaths were true to who he was as a person. And I think that was a great teacher to me. But I think if someone's listening to this who's about to face a diagnosis, maybe they've not yet been diagnosed, or they know someone who's going through it. If you're supporting a friend, just listen. That's it. You don't need to tell them anything. Just hold out a hand, put out a shoulder, and just say, hey, just sit and listen. Don't say a word. And if it's you that's facing it, then find someone who can also listen to you and to work through those emotions. But it's not easy, but it's also to understand. Again, it goes back to the Buddhist truths, the noble truths. If we're going to live, we're going to suffer. There will be suffering. There will be pain. Nobody gets out of this scar-free. You will have to deal with some pretty heavy-hitting things. And the dream is that you don't, right? The dream is you grow old and you go to sleep in your 90s and pass away in your sleep. But no, that's not the true reality. And I think that takes us right the way back to those 18,000 forehead seconds in a day and how we spend them. And I always say to people, leave the house with curiosity, compassion, and come at life from a level of curiosity and compassion, and be a good person. And that will be reflected in your karma and the energy that you put around you. Even when you're facing the hardest of days, a simple smile can change someone's day.
Do you think that during all those hardships, all those various different diagnoses, various different surgeries, do you think that you actually found meaning in that suffering? Because I know during my own periods of hardship, it was the books that I was reading. We've talked before about things like Man's Search for Meaning, but those kind of books where to find a deeper purpose, a deeper meaning, a deeper connection to the world that we live. And also, I think equally, I had a difficult moment whereby some of my friends at the time, they couldn't relate to what I was going through. And therefore, back to what you're saying about solutions, I just wanted to vent. I didn't need solutions. I just needed to articulate how I was feeling at that moment in time and move forward. It changed my outlook, looking back, reflecting. And we talked previously about the Darlow quote that really impacts my view in regards to pain plus reflection equals progress. You have to go through those various different steps, and it's horrendous. We've both experienced different hardships in different ways, but yeah, like that whole finding of meaning. I'd love to get your take on that now.
I think it's such I like to thin slice things, because I think the meaning of life is such a big, overwhelming question, and then your purpose and what's your purpose in the universe, within the world, and how that unravels. It's such a big thing, and it takes a lot of work. And like you, in 2016 is probably when I first started to explore this. The first book I read in this genre was Man's Search for Meaning. Somebody gave it to me and said, if you can find meaning in all of this. And I wrestled with what that was. And then I sort of dialed down on my why, my purpose, why I do things. It wasn't the purpose of a partner. My purpose as a friend, and making sure that my values show up in all of these relationships. And I think that I was sitting wrestling with this last night. I'm writing a book about this whole journey, and I was thinking, my partner asked me, she's like, why are you writing it? And I was like, that's a great question. That's a question I've also asked myself. And then I said, look, I want to read my purpose out to you. And then from my purpose, hopefully you'll understand why I'm writing something. So I read my purpose, and I felt like my purpose was to share through the power of storytelling about how beautiful life can be if we live in line with our values as kind, compassionate human beings. When we leave our house in the morning, rather than thinking, I need to get to work, think we all need to get to work. And then why would I want to spread that message? Is I want to live in a world that I'm surrounded by like-minded people who are compassionate. They're less reactive to situations. They're more responsive to a situation, between that stimulus and response, rather than being reactive and being angry. That we as a human race are all trying to collectively just make the world a better place. And I feel that I have been given a gift in some form of way with the cancer to be able to use that as a mechanism of storytelling to say to people, hey, look, life is short. We're all going to face some real hard adversity. Why make things more difficult for your neighbor or your person you pass on the commuting car or train when everyone's already dealing with something already? And I think that it's been easy for me to intellectually understand it. It's been very difficult to apply it, because we go back to our base level, we go back to human doing rather than human being, and really just trying to slow down is super, super hard. And I was listening to someone speak a few months ago, and they said every hour they stop for 10 seconds and just connect to their breath. And I told somebody this the other day, and they're like, I don't have time to do that. And I was like, it's only for 10 seconds every hour. Yeah, I don't have time. I'm too busy. And I thought, wow, you're going to wake up one day and think, where did my life go? Because you're not seeing everything. You're not being able to feel and be present in the present moment. And I think this is one of the greatest things we struggle in humanity now, is just to be present, just to be where your feet are and be in that moment. And I think from me to be able to accept the paralysis, accept my mortality, I thought, okay, as Franco would say, what is the meaning of it all? What is the meaning in the suffering, so I can have some level of acceptance? And I don't know if there is meaning in it all. It sucks. I wish I wasn't suffering. But within it all, I'm thinking, okay, for me to live a life I feel that it's a valued life and a life well lived, it has to make difference to something better and greater than oneself. So I was like, how do I impact people? I can use my story. So then I get meaning from it all, and it gives me purpose. And then I'm like, okay, I have something to fight for, something to live for. And I think if you look at any great person that the world's seen, from Gandhi to Mandela to all these people, they had a purpose and they had something that they really believed in and really stood for. And I think that's a super powerful thing. And then when we can have a collective group of people who have a similar mindset, then that would be such a lovely world to live in. And I think that if we each do our own little bit and we drop our own little pebble in a lake and cause our own little ripple effect, we can go for our morning coffee and smile and say good morning to people, rather than people just barging past us in a rush. So yeah, I don't know what your takes are on finding meaning and purpose, Peter, from what you've gone through and the books you've read. I know we've read a lot of similar books. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I think for me personally, one of the biggest changes we experienced was when we had kids. I remember when we had Albie, it was during COVID, and I found that quite challenging. Not too long after, we had twins, and that their kind of arrival in this world was quite turbulent, to say the least. We were in hospital for quite a bit. And looking back, there's a lot of challenge at that point in time. I personally struggled. I was worried for my wife and my two twins. At the same point, Albie was in a different hospital for a different thing. There's uncertainty I struggle with. But then equally, as you evolve into the role of being a father, it does change your outlook quite substantially in regards to what I stand for and what I believe in. Ultimately, I want to try and leave in my own way the world in a better place through some form of impact and legacy. At the moment, I'm trying to figure that out. But I know that all of these questions that I ask myself and all these experiences that I go through today wouldn't have been possible were it not for that traumatic event that occurred previously. And that person, like you talked about the contrast between the David of today, and that contrast is intriguing because you almost have to let go of your past self to move forward. And it's strange because mentally, how you view the world and how you view challenge and change, it does evolve. This gets me to the point of what we talked about previously on one of our conversations about post-traumatic growth. And I'd love to get your take on that.
Yeah, I first came across that word when I first started on my master's. There was a module in positive psychology. So a lot of Marty Seligman's work, who dived into a lot of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he'd looked at a lot of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work, and they came out a lot of around, taking a lot from Frankl and some of the early sort of psychologies around what he spoke around, and then just that whole movement that Martin Seligman had created, I think out of University of Pennsylvania, at UPenn, around post-traumatic growth. And I can't remember if it's Carl Dweck's work, who specialized in it more. My names are escaping me. But I looked a lot at the post-traumatic stress and the post-traumatic stress disorder, and how it had been labeled, and everyone was like PTSD from your spinal, the trauma. And then I thought there's also post-traumatic growth from this. And I remember sitting listening to a lecture from, I think, Martin Seligman when he spoke about it. And I also think that's when I say cancer has been a great teacher, because I do think that sometimes it takes a big trauma to initiate change. And sometimes it doesn't. I've seen people with lung cancer at hospital going out with their drips and smoking cigarettes in the hospital car park. They're never going to change. But for many people, that big trauma is an awakening to the question of, why am I here? What's my purpose? What's the meaning of life? All of these real deep existential questions that humans have probably wrestled with for 200,000 years. And that is maybe a big enough trauma to initiate change of habit. And for me, I think that's where I see cancer. It was this, I didn't ever look at it as a victim of why me. I was like, what can I still do? What can I still do to thrive as a human being, to flourish as a human being? I looked at the positive psychology model on PERMA. I wrote my thesis on PERMA around the PERMA model of positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning and achievement. And all of that, that's like a real great foundation to create in post-traumatic growth. And what I was really interested about when I was in hospital, there was none of these conversations happening. It was very much about the negative. It was very much about what you can't do. Well, you can't do this now. You can't do that. You can't tie your shoelace. You can't go to the bathroom. You can't have sex. You can't have this. You can't go climbing. And I was like, wow, is there anything I can do? What's the point in living? And I was like, I want to focus on what I can do. And that just came from a natural, I'm a very much optimistic person. My glass is always half full. I've always been quite joyful and joyful. And I've always searched for solutions. I've never sort of focused problem. I was like, well, there's got to be something I could. If I can't run, then I'll bobsleigh. If I can't bobsleigh, then I'll ski. So I think I was gifted with those characteristics and attributes that I naturally leaned into post-traumatic growth without being aware of it. And then as I started to study and research and read the literature, I was like, oh, wow, I was really lucky that I just fell into this. But then I was thinking, if you're not read up on this subject and you don't have interest in it, and you find yourself lying in a hospital bed, facing whatever it may be, then the PERMA model is a great model. Even if you're not facing tragedy, if you look at the blue zones around the world, some of the oldest people live community, a sense of belonging, the tribal sort of having your friends there, having some form of meaning to your day, something you are passionate about and you can engage in, something where you have some level of achievement. So you feel like you're achieving things. And all of these things are great, I think anyway, are great attributes to post-traumatic growth. And I think that in a hospital setting, if we could implement that sort of PERMA model as a foundational step as part of the rehabilitation. So in the spinal cord hospital, they very much focused on the physical sense. Can you transfer? Can you do this? And there was no looking after the human. And I see this through sport as well. In sport, they're developing athletes, but not humans. And I think even in school, it's about, well, what do you want to do when you grow up? It's never about who do you want to be. It's always focused on what do you want to do. From the minute you can articulate your words, people are asking you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And it starts off, I want to be an astronaut. Don't be so stupid. You can't do that. What do you want to be? And then eventually you end up potentially getting to university, do a course you don't really like. You end up in a job that you don't really like, to then just be stuck in this hamster wheel doing things you're not really like. Then you wake up at 50 on a neurological ward having a stroke, going, wow, what's happened? And I don't mean to sound morbid by that, is that in 14 years I've been in hospital, most of my fellow people inside of me were there through brain tumor or stroke or early onsets of dementia or MND. Every single one of them always said to me, if I could live my life over again, I would do stuff that really set me alive. And I started to think, wow, okay, we need to change the whole model. So to get post-traumatic growth, I think we have to go all the way back to primary school, start teaching emotional intelligence, start teaching basic psychology, basic physiology. How do you manage your thoughts, feelings, and emotions? And there needs to be a life module in primary school. So we make more adaptable, malleable human beings. And then eventually, if people were really clear on their principles and values, they'll make choices based on where they want to go in life, whether it's university, trade, jobs. They'll make them based on their values rather than being reactive human beings. And I think this all plays into this post-traumatic growth. When then you're faced with a challenge, you have the emotional fluency and the capacity to be able to step back, and rather than being reactive, you'd be able to look at it more from a responsive point of view and say, how do I want to show up? Who's going to show up today? Is it David, who's not in control of his emotions, flying off the handle, blaming everybody in a complete state of PTSD? Or is it David who's going to show up with the level of humility, authenticity, discipline, focus, kindness, compassion, and make decisions that are people-focused and people-centered focused, where when I leave the house every day, my only intention is that I want to make people smile. I guess if we train three things in our life, we train our physiology, our mind, and our craft. So we can train all our craft, we train our physiology, but very few people invest in the human, training their own human being to know what you stand for, being able to articulate your purpose as a dad, a brother, a mother, a daughter at work. And I think all of those things collectively go into post-traumatic growth. If you face that trauma, and like I say, if I go back to the spinal cord hospital, I think a lot of the fellow patients there are doing okay in life. Okay, they're maybe not jumping off mountains anymore, but they've found some form of meaning and purpose in that trauma, and they're making a difference to something that's greater than themselves. And I think that it's a super complex situation. I think that you're dealing with humans, which are, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion from your initial personality traits, then into your life experiences, and then into ancestral trauma. We've not even gone there yet, from ancestral trauma and your DNA and how that expresses. So I think we're such a complex species. And I think sometimes we do wrestle with, what are we even doing here? What is the point to everything? Which I went through that. I had a low apathy for a long time. And then I thankfully came out of that. And again, went back to that sort of post-traumatic growth side of things. And I think, I've explored it academically and I've tried to apply it. But I think with anything, that we're all in this human journey, and some days you get it right and some days you don't. And the days you don't get it right, what did you learn and how do you want to show up the next day to just be that little bit better? and be a bit more compassionate, a bit more kinder, maybe a bit more disciplined, whatever your principles are.
I'm glad you said that, because it's true that we are all human in regards to how we show up. And some days you can show up and you'd be absolutely sound. And then other days it's difficult to get out of bed. And I think that in that regard, just the appreciation that we are all human and we do have this kind of ebbs and flows of experience, and that's fine. It's okay to be like that. And I think that if we are a bit more embracive towards the actual experience and not just be confined to this kind of short-term outlook, like if we face challenge, yes, it's fine to be frustrated and it's fine to get angry in those situations, but equally, you need to also take a moment, like the Stoics used to do, like take that moment of reflection, take that moment of what is this that's teaching me. And that's the hardest thing to do when you are trying to embrace what is very much a differentiation between a growth and a fixed mindset. If you want that growth continuously, then with growth comes challenge and change, and you're going to have to face the negative aspects as well.
You know, you have to have the most difficult conversation you'll ever have in your life, and it's with yourself. And I think that's why journaling is great. Stoics speak a lot about journaling and writing down what went well through the day, what can I do better tomorrow. But I guess it's many ways the death of the ego, knowing when you're ego driven, what the ego is doing, where it's driving you. Are you being caught up in this social comparison world and seeking for external validation? I think a lot of us are sometimes just trying to find our belonging, our tribe. That's super important. And hundreds of thousands of years ago, if you were ostracized from the tribe, it meant you were going to die because you wouldn't eat, and you needed your tribe to survive. So I think it's super important to be able to reflect, to be reflective, to have that introspection. But that's a difficult conversation to have, because you might get answers that you don't like, and you're like, I don't like that answer about myself. But then neuroplasticity is a great thing. And if there's certain traits that appear that you're thinking, I don't really like that trait, I want to replace that. And that's the difference between goals and values. I think goals are obviously a set destination. Values are not. Values are just our compass to life. And you might have a value that you just don't really like. And you're thinking, you know what, I want to turn the spotlight on that value down, and I want to shine the spotlight a little bit more, maybe on kindness and compassion. And okay, today I didn't quite get there, but tomorrow I'm going to be a bit more kind, a bit more compassionate, or I'm going to be a bit more disciplined. I think a lot of the people I follow are very disciplined at what they do. And that's something I'm always inspired to be more disciplined. And when I have some times where I sit and reflect in my journals, I'm like, you could have been more disciplined there. And when I spend time with Chris Hoy, who's a great friend of mine, he's like the epitome of discipline, and every part of his life is so disciplined. And I always strive to be more disciplined when I'm around him. And I think that's a great thing that leads into, we want to surround ourselves with good people. I remember driving through Jamaica, and I seen on the back of this van that it was a small minds talk about people, average minds talk about events, great minds talk about ideas. And sometimes I can be with some friends and all that, they're just gossiping about everybody. And I'm like, oh, I don't like this. I feel really uncomfortable. I would rather talk about ideas and events or things that have happened rather than other people. And that's when I became really aware of, like, who do I surround myself with? And that has a big impact on neuroplasticity and also on your frequency.
100%. In regards to my experience that I went through, at that point in time, we both leaned into similar books. I landed on Tyson Fury and the journey he had when he left the sport and came back. That was in and around the time I was pretty ill. Mm-hmm. That was a source of inspiration. I remember Huberman around that time was speaking on the Rich Roll podcast. He was talking about the premise of introjection and the ability to take that inspiration and wisdom from others into your own life. That was a key driver for me. It helped me understand some motivations and those far-reaching goals that I want to achieve. I remember reading Rich Roll's book, actually, and thinking, my God, this is an insane journey. That's the cool thing about the world we live in now. Yes, there is an awful lot of challenge and change and turmoil, and people are experiencing a lot of hardships at this moment in time. Equally, there is these like awesome lights out there where you can lean into and take that wisdom, knowledge and inspiration and channel it into your own life. Make those positive change, because I think that who you want to become starts in the actions that you do today. And that ultimately, to me at least, has been driven by not necessarily in close friends and family, because when you talk to people that haven't experienced it, it's a difficult thing for them to relate to maybe. But when you see people that have had to deal with a lot of trauma and go through it and grow through it, then I think that there's a lot of inspiration to be garnered there too.
I think we all look for hope, right? We all look for hope and vicarious experiences. If I can see somebody that's gone through something similar to myself and they're doing really well, then I'm like, okay, there's hope. I know Chris speaks a lot about this now. When he was diagnosed with this cancer, he'd seen I think it's the lead singer from Duran, also had prostate cancer. And he's like, he's doing really well. So actually, if he's doing well, then I can do well. And I think that's super important. I think that we live in great times where we can share. I remember reading Rich Roll's story for the first time and wow, he's made a massive change in his life. And I think where Rich is really great as well is with authenticity. He won't tell you that he's a Buddhist monk. He'll say, I still struggle. I still struggle with being dragged into being a human doing rather than a human being. And I think that's where authenticity is super important. I have a friend who calls me Superman and I'm like, I'm not Superman. I am a human being. I get it wrong daily. I get it wrong all the time. I'm just trying to learn what is the best language to use navigating cancer, spinal injury, and mortality. The best intentions to take into the world every day. How do I manage my thoughts and my feelings and my emotions and my behaviors? How do I become less reactive? And I get it wrong all the time. And I need to pull myself back and reset myself. And that might be having a meaningful conversation, or it might just be catching a glimpse of myself in the mirror going, whoa, slow down. Or it might be I've picked up someone's book and I've read it and been like, wow, okay, actually, I need to reset again and go again. And I think that we're all just trying to work this out. And I don't think any one person has the answer. And that's where we can lean into each other. I remember speaking to somebody years ago and they're like, I don't understand this gratitude thing. I don't really get it. Like, I just get up and I just go and do all my stuff. And I was like, you walk past Great Ormond Street on your way to work, right? And they're like, yeah. Just drop in. And if you can't leave with gratitude after being in the Great Ormond Street, then you're possibly a psychopath. Because the only people who don't have emotions are dead people and psychopaths. And I remember saying to him, what's your values? What's your principles? What's your passions? And he couldn't tell me any of these things. And I think it was about a year ago, I came up with this little metaphor of a self-care chair. And I see self-care as it's not selfish. It's super important. I think everyone should have some form of self-care program. And I just thought, okay, if I'm sitting on a chair, I can have the weight of the world pressed down on me. But as long as I've got my 4 legs of my chair, then I can take a lot. And my 4 legs is one, being in nature. The second leg is doing some form of sport and movement. The third leg is being around good people, friends, having nice relationships. And the fourth leg is, am I making a difference to the world? And if I can expose myself to those 4 things daily, weekly, I can put up with pretty much anything. But if you take all of them away, and you sit me in oncology and tell me that I've got 3 months left to live, I'm a mess. I'm falling apart. I'm reactive. I'm falling out with my loved ones. I'm not nice to be around. But if I've got those 4 things in place, then I can deal with the world as it's coming to me and make better decisions. And back to another conversation I had with somebody, they said to me, one of their legs in their chair was fishing. And I said, great. When do you fish? He said, I've not fished in 15 years. I was like, I think you need to make some time, don't you? If that's something you're really passionate about. And it's amazing the amount of humans that don't know their values, don't know their passions. They just become human doing. And it's just like all the time. Wouldn't it be nice to have the wisdom that you've achieved through trauma, pre-trauma?
It would be unreal. But
Yeah.
Looking at those experiences, you then have a deeper moment of reflection. One of the things that I worry about is not necessarily people not living a life that's true to themselves, but missing out on moments in any form of change. A lot of it rests on the shoulders of the individuals.
Yeah.
Like, life in itself is boundless of experiences and opportunities, and the ability to connect with one another. That's where the joy of everything evolves from. I look at people scrolling away their lives or not having any values or not really living life to the fullest. And yeah, I feel a bit saddened towards that, really.
I think it's sad. And I think Australia have done a great thing by banning social media I think that's a great move. I really do. I think this whole followers, likes, I love social media because that's how people connect. I like LinkedIn. I'm an avid user of LinkedIn. I am on Instagram, but I hate that our value on these platforms is gathered by how many likes we get, how many followers. This is crazy. And we control this. We have created a society that's based on validation by someone saying, I have 1 million followers. So that's validating my whole life. And if they lost their profile tomorrow, it'd be catastrophe. It'd be almost worse than a cancer diagnosis for some of these people. And we've created this. And I'm thinking this is mental how we've created this. Technology is an amazing thing. The AI revolution, the technological revolution, how it's saving lives. It's just the stuff it's given us is amazing. But amongst it all, we've also caused like the biggest health crisis that's potentially ever been caused by having people just sit and scroll. I find it frightening if I look at my phone and it tells me I've screen time 9 hours. That's horrendous. And I have just come back from Cambodia and I met some of the happiest people I've ever met. And they were arguably the poorest people I'd ever met. And I thought, wow, I was like, what have we created in society? I'm not saying that we shouldn't have created that. I think it's also brought people together. It's a great platform of listening and sharing wisdom and knowledge. But get rid of the likes, get rid of the followers thing, and just go back to a world where we're actually just sharing wisdom and knowledge and inspirational stories, and we're sharing good stuff that helps move people. But unfortunately, I guess the negative stuff sells. And I feel it's so sad because it's humans that have put us in this position. And I went back home to Scotland this year and I was watching a friend of mine's boy who's 18 and he cannot remove himself from his phone. He literally is stuck there. And I'm sitting there going, wow, you are missing out. And I always say this, the greatest gift in life is literally watching a bird land on a tree. And that is beautiful. Like, we don't need to look at a screen. It breaks my heart when I walk through Hyde Park and people are like this walking through Hyde Park. I was like, put it down and look at the birds, look at the foxes, the squirrels, nature. It's the most beautiful gift, but people take it for granted because they see it every day. They never stop and just be truly present in the moment and see the beauty in impermanence. I replaced the word death and mortality with impermanence. I think impermanence is beautiful. This conversation is impermanent. Today is impermanent. The seasons are impermanent. And that's also the beauty of life. It's impermanent. And with having the knowledge and wisdom that it's impermanent should make you more content and more present in the moment so that you actually fully enjoy the moments you're in, not just trying to get to the next thing.
Yeah, 100% agree. You've got to be conscious about how you spend your time. It's very easy to fall into the trap of spending your time in circles or in situations that maybe not serving you to the best of your abilities or the person you want to be or striving to become. And just that element of consciousness during those processes, I think, is important. Honestly, I could talk to you all day. But there's a few things that I just wanted to close out on. When we talk about paralysis, what's the actual day-to-day living with paralysis like? Because to a lot of people, there's almost this go-to that if you're paralyzed, you've got to be in a wheelchair. But that's not always the case. So what's the day-to-day living with paralysis like? Looking at where you are now, what's the David of today striving towards and interested in, and what's inspiring you? And I guess the David of tomorrow, who are you motivated to becoming or wanting to do in the foreseeable future?
Yeah. So great question. So day-to-day living with paralysis is tough. I'm not wheelchair bound, but I'm a wheelchair user. So I have a stick, I get around, but I have to plan bathroom visits. That doesn't always work out. So I can wet myself, I wet the bed. I can't really go out and do what I wanted to do. So I'm constantly managing my body. I have huge levels of fatigue. Just there's a vulnerability in it. There's a loss of dependence. I can't tie laces. I can't properly dress myself. So people only ever see snippets. They might see me on a golf course or skiing and be like, wow, you're smashing out of the park. But everything that surrounds that is just a challenge, like just getting to the bathroom, trying to make a meal. All of this stuff is super hard. Then there's the pain, then there's the spasticity. There's all sorts of other complications. Some days you can be on the toilet for an hour trying to do a bowel movement. So there's just all this. It's a full-time job trying to manage paralysis. who is David as we sit today? I've started reading a lot of Buddhist philosophy. I'm very new to the subject, but I've taken on very powerful as this non-identity. I am here with you at the moment. I'm just being. The David of tomorrow also wants to be more just being, and that just to be content and always remind myself every breath I take is a blessing. We come into this life on an inhale, we leave on an exhale. Two very important breaths, but every breath is important. And I just want the David of tomorrow to be fully appreciated and fully in the moment of wherever he's doing. And ultimately, what I really want him to do is make a difference to other people's lives and have some fun. Like I like fun. I'm a funny person. I like to joke and have lighthearted fun. I think it's great to have the deep, meaningful conversations, but I also like to talk about stupid stuff and have a bit of lighthearted fun as well. I think it's a good balance between hedonistic and eudaimonic. It's two sides of the coin. I feel if I'm fully meaning and purpose, I'll stop getting invited to parties. So I also like to have fun and see the lighter side of life. Sometimes I think to myself, why are you so serious? It's not brain surgery. And I think back to some of my times on the neurological wards. I've laughed more in those wards than I've laughed anywhere else. And dark humor plays a big part of that. And where do I get inspiration from? I get inspiration from everybody. I think we should be very careful in getting inspiration from somebody doing something that like winning gold medals, because we don't really know their moral fiber. And I think that we can get motivation from it. I'm motivated to go and train harder or achieve this because I've seen somebody achieve it. But I think to get fully inspiration from somebody, I think we got to take time to get to know them as a moral person and what their values are and what they stand for. And I think Chris Hoy is a perfect example of someone who is driven with integrity and authenticity and humility, and also was the world's best at what he did. And I get a lot of inspiration from how Chris is. But I think ultimately on this journey, I just want to be a better human being. I want to be more kind, more compassionate, and just generally try, like yourself, try and leave this world in a better place.
Man, it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you. I hope it's the first of many conversations, because I've really enjoyed the times that we've had conversations thus far, and there's definitely a beer in there somewhere.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But I always finish out with, what would you like to leave with our audience, like a key thought?
Just be where your feet are. Be where your feet are. Be in the moment. If you're with your family, drop the device, engage in conversations, play chess, drafts, dominoes. If you're at home, if you're watching a movie, watch a movie together. Just be more connected to the world around you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Here, I wish you all a very blessed 2025, and it's been great to spend some time with you today.